Hello, and welcome to Addressing Trauma in Educational Settings. This is Module 1 of a series focused on impacts and symptoms of trauma and relevant strategies to support students. This offering is available for a certificate of completion is available for this offering, and you will notice on the REL event page that you can contact me, and my email is there for you. If you are viewing this through the West Virginia Department of Education, you can also reach out to me at ladata@elevation.com for a certificate of completion by November of 2021. That email address is lydotta@levation.com. Next slide. So our agenda today, we will do a brief welcome and overview, and then we will work through understanding trauma and its impact in schools, followed by reviewing multi-tiered approaches to address trauma. We'll take a brief break around 11:15, about midway through, and then we will discuss helping students with trauma-informed approaches before our wrap-up and next steps. Next slide, please. So it is a pleasure to be with you. My name is Ladata Taylor, and I am the president of Elevation and also work with the Adventure Group, and I am happy to be your facilitator for this session today. Next slide. I would like to start by orienting you briefly to the Regional Educational Labs, sometimes known as REL. The RELs are administered by the Institute of Education Sciences within the U.S. Department of Education. There are 10 RELs across the country that work in partnership with stakeholders to conduct applied research and trainings with the mission of supporting a more evidence-reliant education system. This offering is coming to you from REL Appalachia. REL Appalachia covers West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. It is led by SRI International with support from various partners. As mentioned, we rely on research and evidence to help educators and practitioners use this in practice. To do this, the REL team supports stakeholders in various ways to help stakeholders understand the evidence base of certain practices or how to collect data or monitor practices and help you understand if practices are working or not. Next slide, please. The REL carries out their work through three main activities. Those activities are first to provide educators and other stakeholders with training, coaching, technical support in using research findings and evidence in the classroom to improve teaching and learning. Secondly, to conduct a wide variety of applied research studies. And finally, to disseminate those findings from research in ways that educators and policymakers can use in practice. Next slide, please. In addition to our ongoing work with partners, we offer several services that support quick turnaround requests for data and evidence. First is Ask a REL. Ask a REL is a collaborative reference desk service provided by the 10 regional educational laboratories and functions much in the same way as a technical reference library. If you have research-based education questions, we provide references, referrals, and brief responses. We can also support understanding and assessing the levels of evidence outlined in the Every Student Succeeds Act. And we also have just-in-time studies, which are quick turnaround research studies that use secondary data to provide insights on research questions more quickly than traditional research studies. Next slide, please. We disseminate our work through a variety of channels, including our websites, REL blog post, Twitter, YouTube, and newsletters. For example, the REL YouTube channel offers short videos that demonstrate ways that educators are using evidence in practice. We hope that you will connect with us through this variety of channels. Next slide, please. So this is part one of a three-part professional development series. REL Appalachia and its partners at the West Virginia Department of Education have co-developed this professional development series. The series includes 3 modules. Module 1 today, impacts and symptoms of trauma and relevant strategies that you can use to support students. The second module, classroom and school practices to support students experiencing trauma. And the third module, school systems, policies, and procedures to support students experiencing trauma. Recordings will be available on the REL Appalachia website and for West Virginia educators through the WVDE Learning Management System. Next slide, please. The objectives for this module, building knowledge about impacts and symptoms of trauma and relevant strategies that you can use to support students. And we hope to increase understanding of the negative impacts of trauma on the brain and body, students' behavioral, social, emotional, and academic difficulties that result from trauma that may be observed in the educational setting, and multi-tiered approaches to addressing trauma and relevant strategies and practices to support students. Next slide, please. So the context for the professional development series on supporting students experiencing trauma, next slide, are to really look at student trauma in West Virginia schools. We know that traumatic stress induced by family and community opioid use negatively impacts students' well-being and outcomes. School staff in West Virginia communities affected by both substance abuse and COVID-19 need support to help students. Given the prevalence of these problems that touch all students and families, universal support for all students is needed. Schools play a critical role in supporting students experiencing trauma. Next slide, please. So I would encourage you to pause for a second and answer this question. To what extent are you concerned that your students are experiencing trauma? Very concerned, somewhat concerned, not concerned. Next slide, please. I also would like for you to reflect about what you're most looking forward to learning about today. Next slide, please. So it is my pleasure to introduce your facilitators for today. We have Mariana Linz, Conra Lucas Adkins, and Yunsu Park. I think that you will find this material to be extremely helpful, and at this time, I'll turn it over to our facilitators. Thank you.
Hi, this is Mariana Linz. I'm with the Department of Psychology at Marshall University. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you a little bit about some of the impacts of trauma on our children in the school system. Next slide, please. Every time I look at this little person, I just think about that little face and how significant and troubling some of the behaviors that we see in young children who experience trauma can be. Sometimes they speak so loudly, we almost can't see the child. Next slide, please. It's hard sometimes in our day-to-day work life as teachers to remember that these little folks are doing the best that they absolutely can because their behaviors can be so very challenging. When we see this little person, we always want to keep in mind that they are doing the best that they can, that they have a brain that is really trying to navigate the storm and chaos of trauma on a day-to-day basis. And it is busily building a system to respond to that trauma and chaos the best that it can. And sometimes we forget that this little system is wired for survival. And sometimes that can produce some behaviors that are really difficult to understand and that can be very disruptive. Next slide, please. What we also want to keep in mind are those wonderful successes that we've all experienced, where we see everything coming together to work to help that little person build a different way of facing the world and understanding the world so that they can move forward to a healthier stage of development. Because we always want to keep in mind that whatever the environment broke, our environment of intervention and passion and compassion can help to repair. Next slide, please. So I want you to take a moment and reflect on your experiences over the past, 5 years or so. Try to think pre-COVID. I know it's hard right now. But think about classrooms you've taught or visited. What percentage of the time do you feel like you spend dealing with externalizing behavior? Just kind of get that in your mind for a little bit. Next slide, please. So how has this percentage changed over the last 5 years? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Has it remained stable? Think in your mind, what do you think are some of the causal factors? We've had the opioid crisis. We've had a number of different challenges in terms of the pandemic, but also just day-to-day challenges of economic downturns and stressors and families really trying to cope with quite a bit. How do you think that figured in? Next slide, please. So let's begin by getting on the same page about our definition of trauma. When we hear the term, I think we all feel like we know what it means, but I think it helps to kind of clarify that just for discussion purposes as we move forward. One of the things that I think is most striking about the definition is this idea that it is an event that is experienced and perceived as a threat to safety and stability. I think what's particularly striking about trauma when we think of it in the context of a child's development is it's an ongoing sort of background set of sounds, if you will, that really infringes on their most important developmental task of the day, which is establishing a sense of safety and stability, which will allow them to go out into the world and to learn and to figure things out and experiment and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and really build a healthy path to healthy adulthood. And so when trauma becomes part of the child's world, it blocks that path or it creates some deviations that really can make the journey quite a challenge for that child. So trauma encompasses a wide, diverse set of experiences, and they're very individualized. People do not experience trauma in the same way. They don't define it in the same way. They don't respond to it in the same way. So it can be a very, very difficult sort of seed to navigate, if you will, in terms of understanding the behaviors that go along with adjusting to a world that contains trauma. We're going to talk about the way that we categorize trauma and some of the different kinds of experiences that are out there regarding the children that we work with every day. They can be classified as acute, complex, and historical and intergenerational, and we're going to consider each of those within the context of the child's developmental environment, as well as some consideration of their genetic and biological makeup and how that figures into the causal picture as well. Next slide, please. So let's consider acute traumas first. An acute trauma, at least technically, has a defined onset and a clear end point. I say at least technically, because we seem to identify these in terms of discrete experiences. Things like natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes. I'm from the southern part of West Virginia, and floods are a very unfortunately common occurrence down there, and they can have very devastating impacts. But there's a time pre-flood, and there's a time post-flood, and there's recovery in all of that. But we know that for some families, those impacts can have very, very long-reaching effects. There's also human-crafted disasters like 9/11, even some that don't result in direct loss that still can have very traumatic impacts. accidents with or without injuries, and thinking about, as we're talking about these topics today, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, thinking about the stress that's associated with that and some of the traumas that some children are having to navigate as a result of that through lost jobs, perhaps lost stable housing, and so forth. Next slide, please. So we think about acute traumas. We've probably all seen those situations where children experience an event, say a house fire or a flood or something that comes on very suddenly. And we notice that there are behavioral disruptions that go along with that. They seem more anxious than usual. We know that they're probably not sleeping well, sometimes because of the anxiety, sometimes because of the upheaval and not having a stable place to stay. Behaviors can become very regressive. A child may show a lot of immature behaviors, may melt down in the classroom a whole lot easier than they used to. You know, that kid that could handle the rocket math and get through all those problems now is getting almost to the end of the third row and just not able to continue and dissolving into a puddle. And so the behaviors can become very, very challenging. Some children may even demonstrate some aggression as a result of this. Typically what will happen is a lot of children, as the trauma begins to resolve, as it hits its end point and things begin to come back together, then a lot of the behaviors will decline. Sometimes there's some need for some therapy or some assistance in dealing with the stresses, but a lot of times behavior will return to baseline, but not always. And the impact of that trauma is going to vary quite a bit with a child's own developmental stage, with their environment, with their family system. All of that's going to play a role in how protracted the impact of that acute trauma is. So sometimes we say, well, that flood happened last year. Why am I still seeing these behaviors? And sometimes that can be because the system was simply not able to provide enough buffer or enough of those resilience factors to help the child deal and come back to a level that they were prior to the trauma. So considering things like how much assistance was there for both to support the child and also to return things back to normal. How old is the child? How do they understand what happened? How do they understand whether it's likely to happen again in the future? In other words, going back to the original definition of trauma, are they able to return to a sense of safety and stability? So cohesiveness of the family system, and the resilience factors that are present in the school and the larger community are going to have an impact as well. So that family that was on the edge before the event happened may find that they've been pushed over the edge. And so even though the acute trauma has an end point, it may lead into the next type of trauma that we want to talk about, which is more of the complex trauma. Next slide, please. Complex traumas, unlike acute traumas, involve more patterns of experiences that are disruptive and disconcerting. They occur repeatedly over the course of childhood, even though they may be confined to an extended developmental period, but they tend to occur repeatedly. So they create this environment that really shapes the way the child thinks, that shapes their schema and how they view the world, that shapes, once again, that basic sense of safety and stability and how it's established. And so it's sort of like, I always think about a ship that's out in the ocean and the ocean's rough. It's sort of rolling back and forth, and just as soon as you think you've got your feet under you, it rolls again and you don't have them. And so you have this child who's constantly having to regain their balance in some way and dealing with an environment that just stubbornly refuses to remain stable and doesn't feel safe and doesn't feel secure. So unfortunately, complex traumas can also accumulate. So for example, when we look at the list and we see things like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, child trafficking, poverty, food insecurity, homelessness, having a parent with untreated or unresolved substance use disorder. These sorts of things are not discrete events. They don't occur in a vacuum, and they tend to have ripple effects in the child's world. For example, poverty is not just about not having enough money or not having enough food or not having a nice home. Poverty has a way of creating situations where children have difficulty participating in the normal day-to-day experiences that other children may be able to participate in. And the same is true for the other things that are on the list. Next slide, please. So we think about the impacts of complex traumas. These are the types of experiences that can create those long-term difficulties with trust in relationships, with the maintenance of physical health, with emotional and behavioral dysregulation. These are children that have a difficult time managing those big emotions because their environment simply has not had the stability to help them learn to do that. They often experience cognitive and attentional difficulties. They can experience shame and guilt because they have a world that simply isn't working the way that we would like for it to. And that child is learning about that world and coming to conclusions about the way things work in a way that can be very, very different from children with more stable experiences. So let's think about how some various factors might impact a child's response to complex trauma. We know that there are resilience factors that can help children deal and cope with complex traumas. David Elkind has the best phrase. He said they need children in those situations, well, in all situations. They just need that one adult that is crazy about them, no matter what they do, no matter how many times they melt down, no matter how many times they carry the cat around by the tail, no matter how many times they do these horribly confusing behaviors. There is still that adult going, I believe in you. I see you. I get it. We're going to get through this. And very often that can be an extended family member, but as you all know, it sometimes can be a teacher who sees that spark in that child. And that's important when a child is dealing with the world that is changing and is so chaotic on a day-to-day basis. Another thing that's important is the shared experience in meaning making. I think about poverty and homelessness in particular in terms of how separating they are for children, how different children feel when they're in a classroom setting and they're reading books about families that live in stable apartments and homes, and they're hearing about other people's experience and how different they feel. I've heard adults still talk about that moment when they realized, oh my goodness, everybody doesn't experience this. Everybody doesn't have a situation like this. Everybody doesn't go home to a parent who behaves this way. Every child's not treated this way. And how separate they felt because of that. So finding that, whether it's another child or an adult who has been through that experience and come through the other side, can be a very powerful mechanism for helping children to cope. The trauma sensitivity of the academic environment is critical for kids who are experiencing complex trauma. They have a whole home life that is just rolling and listing all around them, and when they get to school and there's predictability and transparency and security, and hopefully at least one or two adults that are just crazy about you, it truly can be a life-changing experience. Next slide, please. Finally, we want to consider the case of historical and intergenerational trauma. This is one of the newer categories that we've begun to study quite recently over the past 10 or 15 years, but it is an impact that has been around for quite some time. It's similar to complex trauma in the sense that it's not a discrete event, but it also can have sort of this insidious kind of quality to it because it is the impact of trauma that may have occurred generations earlier and has become part of the cultural fabric of the child. So it's trauma that they experience by virtue of either membership within a particular cultural group or membership within a particular family system. So being from Appalachia, I'm familiar with how family names and extended family networks can sort of form these systems, if you will, for various kinds of experiences. So if abuse and harsh parenting have been part of a family system for generations, even if that child is not experiencing physical abuse, the impact of that parent's experience, their worldview, can impact that child. Families who are part of subcultures that have been oppressed, that have experienced violence and aggression by virtue of their group membership, through things like slavery and other types of discrimination. Those things have impact because they impact the schema through which the child views the world. They impact the sets of rules that children have to learn in response to that history of oppression and abuse and maltreatment. And so the way that they navigate can be very, very different. And we know that when there is a shared or collective trauma that's a part of a system that can include a family or a community, that conflict and mistrust, a shift in value systems, socioeconomic disadvantages, all are part of that picture of risk that can be present for the child. So sometimes we'll say, well, I don't know why that would be impacting the child now. That happened in the family, 2 generations back, or, that's not going on any longer. We have laws against that. It doesn't happen. But that family system, that part of the culture knows that it happens. And that colors how we raise our children and how they view the world. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment. We've kind of talked about a lot of things that children experience and kind of see where we are. Which of these on the list do you think constitutes historical or intergenerational trauma? If you're looking at that list and you're thinking, I believe all of those are historical and intergenerational, you're correct. Because they can impact the child if they are experiencing it directly, but they also can impact the child if it has been part of the cultural or family fabric that shapes that child's view of the world. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment and consider some of the specific impacts of trauma on development. Next slide, please. I'll encourage you at this point. We are dealing with discussions of things that are very, very significant, and it can sometimes take an emotional toll. So if you ever feel the moment that you need to take a moment and pause the recording and take a deep breath, or check out Amazon for a moment before you come back, please feel free to take care of yourself as we're going through this. So let's consider what some of the neurobiological and biological risks are that are associated with trauma. First thing I want us to think about is the fact that when we're talking about children, they have a central nervous system that is under construction. And it is this wonderfully responsive little developmental system that literally will grow around the environment that they're in, which is wonderful because I think children who live near me in West Virginia that are born tonight over the next couple of years are going to grow into this little person that speaks fluent English and learns all about things like Netflix and whatever the latest, kid-oriented show will be in a couple of years. And their little brain will go around all of the things that are part of our culture. While a child who may be growing up in China is going to learn a whole different language system, is going to learn a whole set of fine motor skills to manipulate their eating utensils and our child will learn, might learn a different set. And that brain is going to grow around that environment in response to the supports that are present in that environment. And that's a wonderful thing. So brains don't come into the world all done. There's sort of a set of parts that have to be constructed. And we know how it goes. It's just like when you put that bike together on Christmas Eve. The parts that fit we use and we tighten them and make sure they're there. And if we have extra parts, we throw them away and then later regret that. The brain is the same way. What we use, we keep, and it gets stronger and more efficient. What we don't use, we get rid of because that makes the system more efficient. So when we're talking about a normal, appropriately stimulating environment, that's a system that works and works well. It's very adaptive. But when a child is growing up in a system that involves, let's say, complex traumas or intergenerational and historical traumas, or even a set of well-placed acute traumas, then that central nervous system is going to do what every central nervous system does. It will grow around that, and it will grow in response to that. And it will develop systems of managing arousal and behavior that fit within that system. So whereas a child that's living in a world where the environment is pretty stable and predictable, then having experiences that support focusing and seeing small things and seeing things through, experiencing repetition that really strengthens skill sets that allow you to manage your emotional displays, all of that is built into the environment. But when my environment constantly changes and challenges my sense of safety, then developing a system that is built for scanning the environment, responding to tiny changes, responding quickly without a lot of reflection, impulsively, you might say, that's much more beneficial. And a lot of times that's the system that will develop. And so as children get older, we also know that when they're experiencing trauma, they also experience a lot of activation of their stress response. It goes up, it goes down, their heart rate goes up, it goes down. They're on guard, they can relax. And think about that. We might experience that maybe on a daily basis. But certainly, when we're on that hike and we're sure the bear is about to eat us, we experience that. But it's an occasional thing. Contrast that with a child who's growing up in complex trauma, and they may experience that multiple times a day over the course of a long period of time. There are going to be a lot of things that happen in response to that particular constant activation and deactivation of the stress response. You're going to have a child that, yes, is vigilant, we might even say hypervigilant, for some time, that responds very strongly to changes in the environment that might indicate that something is amiss. But also over the course of time, that system is going to habituate. Parts of it are going to wear out. The immune system is going to get very, very tired. And these kids actually are sick more often and more vulnerable to various kinds of infections. Over the course of time, they may appear under-responsive in the classroom environment, particularly to rewards. And that's because there's this wonderful little neurotransmitter in the system called dopamine. And that stress response over time just wears dopamine out. And that's a shame because dopamine makes you feel good, really good, like petting a puppy, getting snuggles and puppy kisses good. Or as I like to say, completing my purchase on Amazon good, knowing it's going to be there in a couple of days. And so that constant activation of what we call the HPA axis will also deplete that dopamine system. So now we have a child that is a little under-responsive, and when we're trying to support their behavior positively and tell them good things about themselves, they don't experience that little jolt of joy the way that other children do, and they're less sensitive to rewards. Next slide, please. So let's think for a moment, because reinforcing behavior and rewarding kids for doing the right thing is so important to teaching them how to respond to the environment. What do you think about when you think about a child who just doesn't experience that same kind of joy in response to that smell good sticker that other kids do? What kinds of things have you seen in those children that just don't seem to be sensitive to the positive things that you tell them about themselves? Sometimes we may even feel like when we say something positive, it impacts their behavior negatively. It may or may not be true, but sometimes it feels that way. Next slide, please. There also are a lot of long-term physical and mental health implications for the experience of trauma. A lot of people these days are now familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or sometimes called the ACEs study. But if this is new, I want to describe it just very briefly in a nutshell. This was a seminal study that had tremendous impact and involved thousands and thousands of subjects. And these were people that came in for typical checkups. These were, for the most part, middle-class individuals. And what they did was they looked at their health status and their health history, and also the number of adverse childhood experiences that they reported. And you'll see in the table some examples of those ACEs that were part of the study. And they fit into the categories of abuse, neglect, and household challenges. And one thing you'll notice is that they are primarily complex traumas. So not things with clear beginnings and ends, but patterns that sort of repeat themselves over long developmental periods. The bottom line to the study was that as we accumulate ACEs, the more that accumulate, there are more significant impacts on physical health. And when we accumulate 3 or more, and it's based on sheer number, not intensity, not duration, they were just checking off, did you experience it? But when we get to that magical number of 3, we begin to see declines in life expectancy for individuals. So in other words, the impacts of trauma in terms of our ability to cope, in terms of impacts on the immune system, in terms of behaviors that we may develop over time that could be risky to our health, all of that increases over time to a point that we actually see decreased life expectancy in individuals who have accumulated trauma. And that was a hugely significant result from this particular study. Next slide, please. What you see here is a list of counties that across the United States that have experienced reduced life expectancy as of 2014. And one of the things that you'll notice is out of the top 20, this is only a few of them, but out of the top 20, there are 4 on this list that are in Appalachia. There are 8 total out of the top 20 that are in Appalachia. And so clearly, Appalachia is an area that's full of challenges and so forth that can act to impact a child's environment and produce trauma. Next slide, please. Just to take a snapshot of my home state of West Virginia, in 2014, a study that was done by the ACEs Coalition, a survey in primary care centers, showed that 14% of adults were reporting 4 or more ACEs. So remember, when you hit 3, there are impacts on health and declines in life expectancy. 56% reported at least 1 ACE growing up. Now, I always like to point out, this was done in primary care settings. Not everybody in Appalachia goes to primary care. I have a lot of relatives who say, I don't need to see the doctor, I'm not sick. And so we know that sometimes that's underutilized. So it's very possible that those numbers are an underrepresentation of what's out there. It is very possible. The most common ACEs are listed that we experience in West Virginia are listed on the slide. And it's always important to consider the family, school, and community protective factors that may be present, because that will impact the outcomes that are associated for an individual with the adverse childhood experiences that they have. And so as we're looking at the behavior of children, we also have to remember that as they accumulate these traumas, their health, their long-term health and longevity are also at risk. Next slide, please. So what are some of the impacts of trauma on learning and behavior? Next slide, please. When trauma is a consistent experience, there's just the short answer is it interferes with learning, and it does that in a lot of ways. We've talked about the adverse impacts on brain development, and those centers that are responsible for attention and memory in particular are vulnerable to the effects of trauma because the environment is constantly changing. Those brain centers work best with repetition and stability, and that simply is in short supply in an environment that involves trauma. So I always say trauma and chaos in terms of learning are a thief. they steal from the child. Children, for example, need language stimulation so significantly during those early years. And when parents are stressed by the challenges of the economy and jobs and their own trauma histories and so forth, they just have difficulty creating that stimulation that's so necessary for the child's development. So that's stolen from the child and the parents. Poverty steals experiences from children, and it interferes with their ability to have those experiences that promote good attention regulation, good emotion regulation, and so forth. And as a result, they can also increase aggression because there simply is the perception that threats are all around, and if I don't take care of myself, no one will. Next slide, please. So we see a number of effects on classroom behavior as a result of conflict. And my colleagues, Conra Lucas Adkins and Yunsu Park, are going to talk more about those. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide. But again, those memory and concentration problems, impairments in creativity and so forth are all part of the picture. And those problems with attention and concentration, part of those so-called executive functions that help us manage emotions and emotional displays, are very significantly impacted because the course of that development is very, very protracted. It begins prior to birth, about 2 weeks post-conception, and brains don't finish till we're almost 25, which, yes, I know explains a lot about older adolescents. But there's quite a bit that needs to go on, and so that particular brain system is really vulnerable to the impacts of trauma over a long period of time and can produce a number of impacts in the classroom. So one of the things that you'll hear from my colleagues is because trauma steals those experiences of consistency, that really means that consistent experiences in the schools and classrooms are very important. Next slide, please. So think about the children that you work with on a day-to-day basis and that you worked with over the years, and particularly the ones whose stories you know with respect to trauma. Think about how it impacted them in the classroom, how they responded to challenge, some of the difficulties that they encountered, but also some of the triumphs, the things that worked, the things that were helpful. Next slide, please. So as we're wrapping up, I do want to make just a couple of comments about parents. Because very often when we see children growing up in environments that are so chaotic and so traumatic, it's easy for us to get kind of maybe a little frustrated from time to time and think, I really wish the parents could do more. I think it's always important, and we know this, to remember that yes, the family environment can serve as an important protective factor. Sometimes we're working with parents who have their own trauma histories, who have their own extensive set of adverse childhood experiences that have colored their world and colored a long history of behaviors and responses from the environment. Kids that maybe went through a school system that was not terribly trauma sensitive, and so have some memories and lessons that they learned from that about how teachers respond when you're having a bad day. And that can be passed on to their children. So it's important to learn from these parents what some of their experiences might be. And we've all had those times where we were able to connect with that parent, to support them in becoming more engaged in the school system, more engaged in their child's development. And over the course of the next couple of modules, we're going to talk about engaging those parents and providing supports that allow them to interact as effectively as they can, both with the school system and their children. But it's important for us to understand, as frustrating as it can be, sometimes they're dealing with their own past, and that can truly be a challenge. REL Pacific has a wonderful toolkit of resources that will give you some ideas about engaging families as community partners, and that link is in the slide. Next slide, please. So just to recap a little of what we've talked about, trauma is a negative patterned experience that impacts long-term that sense of safety and stability, and really colors and shapes the way the child both sees and understands and also responds to the world. And the impacts are very individualized. There are a number of negative impacts on various aspects of development. And it's truly important to understand and engage all aspects of the child's developmental environment in supporting them in developing healthy patterns of behavior that will increase their health and wellness as they progress toward adulthood. So I appreciate your time. And I want to turn the remaining slides over to my colleagues, beginning first with Conrad Lucas Adkins. Thank you.
So much, Mariana, and thanks everyone for taking time to engage in this professional development today. My name is Conrad Lucas Adkins, and I'm with the Department of School Psychology at Marshall. Prior to coming to Marshall full-time, I worked as a school psychologist for about 14 years in West Virginia public schools. As Mariana was talking, I reflected on so many cases that I dealt with when I was in full-time practice, and I thought about the various traumas and the experiences that the children faced. But as I was thinking about those negative experiences, I was also remembering the very positive experiences that I saw so many educators bringing to the lives of these children. And that's what I would like to do in my talk with you today, is to focus on how we can channel our energies and use systems that are in place in our schools to really create positive environments for kids and to foster resiliency and build healthy coping skills in them. Next slide, please. So 2 essential steps I want to talk about, and this is step 1. So step 1 is to become solution focused. So that's what we first need to do. And this involves a mindset shift. And this is not something that costs money, which is wonderful for us to hear. But what it involves is moving from talking about the problem and admiring the problem, if you will, to solving the problem. What can we do that can affect these children and youth in a positive way? We may not have the ability to change anything in their outside world. We can't erase the trauma that they have experienced or the traumas that they will experience, but we can control our school system, and we can create it to be a place that's safe and protective. Next slide, please. All right, so step number 2. So first step, remember, that's changing that mindset. So step number 2 is investigating the framework that you have in place in your school system, and using that framework to be sure that you are building supports for kids and you're addressing those behavioral and emotional needs that they have. So in West Virginia and around the country, we have a system in place that's referred to as the multi-tiered system of support, the MTSS framework. And most of us, when we see this pyramid that illustrates the MTSS framework, we think about academic interventions and supports. This particular illustration I took from the National Center on Safe and Supportive Learning Environments, and it looks specifically at how we can use those supports to address trauma and to address the behavioral and emotional needs of all children. So the bottom of the pyramid is tier 1. And I think it's real important for us to focus on tier 1 because this is the foundation. These are practices that are embedded throughout our entire school environment, our classrooms, and then outside in our cafeterias, on the bus, during recess time. And if these practices are put in place and are implemented with fidelity, then we are going to impact 80% of our youth. That's the majority that we are going to make a positive impact on with regard to those healthy development just overall healthy development that we are wanting to see. Moving on up the tier, we go to tier 2. And so tier 2 is reserved for those kids who are not responding to our tier 1 practices. These are children who may have some more intense needs. Tier 2, these are our secondary interventions, and typically those are provided in small groups. So we may have some small group skills sessions that focus on anger management, focus on coping, focus on dealing with anxiety. And then again, moving on up the pyramid, we go to tier 3. And so tier 3 are those more individualized supports for children. Those are typically provided by our mental health professionals in schools. So those could be our school counselors, our school psychologists, our school social workers. They might also be community providers who are working in our schools, or the providers that we have relationships with. And so I wanted to mention with tier 2, those supports will affect 15 to 20% of the kids. So again, with tier 1, you have 80% of our kids, and then tier 2, 15 to 20%. And so the remaining tier, that's a very small percentage of youth who would need those supports. So the 5 to 10% we can reach through those tier 3 interventions. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we talked about the 2 steps. So changing our mindset to becoming solution focused, and then examining our systems that we have in place to address the needs of all kids. So let's further investigate tier 1. So tier 1, remember, that's the bottom of the pyramid. That's the set of interventions that affect the majority of the kids. This particular illustration was taken from REL Southwest. And it's a very nice way of putting the essentials, I guess the essentials for a trauma-informed environment, putting those into place. And when you look at those a little closer, you're probably going to think, wow, we do this on a daily basis. This is something that I've been doing in my classroom, since I began teaching. So let's focus on number 2. Number 2 is establishing predictability. When I read this, I think about Mariana talking about some of our kids who are in environments where they don't know what's going to happen, from minute to minute. Are they going to be threatened, in the morning and, have a period of comfort but yet be threatened again in the afternoon? So what we want to do in our schools is we want to establish some predictability. What's the schedule, so that the child knows what's going to happen in the morning, what's going to happen in the afternoon. And many classrooms that I visited, they have their daily schedule posted. There are events that happen in schools. There are things that we can't necessarily predict, but what we can do is we can talk with kids about how to handle those unpredicted events. For example, some unpredicted events are positive in schools, like we might have a school assembly. Some may not be positive. It might be unsettling to have a fire drill. It also, for some kids, is a little unsettling to have a substitute teacher, but we can prepare them. We can prepare them for those changes. And then number 3 on this list also really caught my attention, and that's building a sense of trust. Remember, in the environments that some of our kids are living in and coming from, they don't have that sense of trust. There's not that one person that they can receive support from continually. So that's something that in our schools, we want to be sure that we can offer them. So being honest with them when things don't go the way that we expected them to, provide them with transparent explanations. Okay, next slide. So going a little further with tier 1 support, I found this resource from Safe Supportive Center for Learning, and it is a general guidance document that really helps schools to enhance the system that they have and make it more trauma informed. So this particular guide, it's a facilitation guide, and what I like about it is that this guide offers a self-assessment so that you as educators, as school leaders, as teachers, you can take a look at this self-assessment and figure out what are some things that you are already doing, what are some strengths, and then you can see some areas that you might need to improve upon. And for those areas that you might need to improve upon, this guidance document provides you with some tips and some strategies and things that you may want to consider implementing in your school. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, I practiced school psychology in West Virginia for several years, and I saw a lot of positive things that were happening. As Mariana shared with you some of these statistics about West Virginia, you know, we have a large number of our children who are facing adverse experiences, and we have poverty and high unemployment rates. I think about West Virginia as being a state that was really at the forefront of putting together resources for our children, you know, for all children, and for focusing on their behavior and emotional development. So with this slide, I highlighted a few things that have been put together by our West Virginia Department of Education. And these are resources that our teachers and school leaders can consult to help strengthen those systems. So the first listing on the slide is the Behavior and Mental Health Technical Assistance Center. And this center is funded by the West Virginia Department of Education, and it's housed at Marshall University on the Huntington campus in the Autism Training Center. And I provided the link for you. This center employs behavioral specialists who are assigned to various regions of our state, and educators can contact them to provide, you know, either virtual support, you know, through discussions, or, you know, in certain instances they can schedule large group trainings. And there are many resources that are available just for your viewing. You can, you know, click on what you're interested in, such as positive behavior supports, and you'll be provided with some resources. Secondly on the list is trauma-informed practice. And West Virginia has compiled lots of resources. And one of the most popular, I think, if you're a West Virginia educator, you will recognize this, but Reclaim West Virginia. So I've put a couple of websites there so that you could click on those and explore what's already been put together for you. And then lastly, and this is something that's happened recently, this was during this school year, West Virginia Department of Ed partnered with the West Virginia School Psychological Association to offer some training on crisis prevention and intervention. So offer a really nice framework for how to address a crisis, and then some proactive things that you can do prior to a crisis to strengthen your system. And that particular model that's being used is referred to as PREPARE. So that's the acronym. And it's something that has been researched and promoted by the National Association of School Psychologists. So if you are interested in learning more about PREPARE, the website is listed there for you to go to. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now let's take a minute just to think about the children that you've worked with, and to think about your schools and the supports that you have. And you may want to pause the recording as you are reflecting on this item. So my comfort level with understanding the MTSS framework for the emotional and behavioral needs of students is, and you have some choices: completely comfortable, somewhat comfortable, or not comfortable at all. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so now let's talk about moving through the tiers. Remember, I showed you the pyramid illustration, and we talked a little bit about tier 1. So how do you know, when tier 1 is not enough, when you need some tier 2 supports, or when you need some more individualized supports at tier 3? Okay, next slide, please. One of the key features of MTSS is assessment, and using assessment to determine the needs of your students, whether it be the academic needs or the behavior needs, and then aligning those needs with evidence-based practices. Now, I'm not sure about you, but when I hear the word assessment and assessment in schools, I step back and I think, oh no, it's going to take some time. It might require some additional training for those who are going to be the evaluators. Teachers might be doing more training, or we might have to call in some external supports. School psychologists might be involved. And when I'm going to talk with you about assessments today, I am going to talk about those more formal measures. So those measures that may require an external person coming in and doing the scoring and interpretation. But I'm also going to talk with you about some informal methods of assessment. So, when we're thinking about these informal methods, we are going to actually remember, hey, these are some things that I do on a day-to-day basis. And, these are some practices that we engage in quite frequently in my school, and just perhaps didn't realize that, this could be utilized as an assessment tool. So again, two categories. We're going to talk about formal measures, and those formal measures involve things like rating scales and screening tools. And, as a teacher, you may have in fact completed a rating scale about a student in your class, or maybe several students in your class. But then that rating scale went to someone else for scoring and interpretation. So that is one method of assessment that takes place in schools. But then, as I mentioned, the informal methods, these would be school record reviews, and also conversations, just talking with students, talking with your colleagues about issues that kids are facing, and just circumstances that are in the community. And then media, paying attention to what media is reporting about communities, and then also paying attention to what messages kids are receiving. Sometimes, kids need help processing, the information that they're receiving through media, because without it, they may have some, significant misinterpretations. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's focus on the formal measures first, the category of formal measures of assessment. And the one I am showing you on this slide is from the Behavior Assessment System for Children, 3rd edition. So it's from the BASC-3 system. And the reason I wanted to show this to you first is because I know in West Virginia, many of our school psychologists use a component of this system when they are evaluating students to determine eligibility for special education services. So, many of you may have completed these rating scales, and they are pretty lengthy. Now, the one I want to focus on, it's a component of the BASC-3, but it is a screener, and it's referred to as the BESS, the Behavioral and Emotional Screening System. And so again, it would be completed by teachers. It could also be completed by the students themselves as a self-report, or parents. It's much shorter, only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to complete, but it provides you with some excellent information about externalizing problems, internalizing problems, and then adaptive skills. So you're going to see some strengths and weaknesses. If you would review a BESS on a classroom or a grade level, a school, you could really find out, what percentage of your students are in need of some more of those intensive supports. Also, it's important to remember that these screening tools can be used to progress monitor. So if you're wanting to see how your kids are responding to the various supports in place, this is an excellent tool to use. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another example of a formal measure, and this formal measure is the UCLA Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Index. And I know that sounds clinical, when you hear it, and yes, this could be used in a clinical setting for more diagnostic, treatment purposes. But the author of, one of the authors of this index talks about its utility in schools as a screener. So, in thinking about, community events, significant stressors that happen that affect community community or affect the schools, this would be a really nice screener to use just so you can get a picture of how your students are handling the stressor, and are there some more targeted supports that you need to provide to help them gain some healthy coping skills. Next slide, please. I definitely wanted to point this out to you. This is a screener that has been made available for free from the UCLA group, and it's specific to our time right now with COVID-19. So this is a screener that could be used to just figure out how your students are coping with our current pandemic. What's their stress level? I know we all think about, our own stress level, and we want to make sure that we are supporting our kids, in the ways that they need. So this is also a screening tool to be used. And again, I said right now, it's available for free. So hopefully, many folks will be able to take advantage of that tool. Okay, next slide. All right, so we talked about our formal measures. So let's get back to our informal measures. And again, these are things that you are probably doing on a daily basis. So let's think about that, think about what you're doing and how we can use that information to help assess where kids are and to determine what supports need to be put into place for them. So I mentioned school record reviews. School record reviews involve things like daily attendance, who's present, who's absent. Is there, a consistency? Are we seeing some kids who are absent more often? If so, are there certain days of the week? Are we seeing for our older students, are there, tardies to classes or classes that they're, skipping? Are there frequent checkouts? Are some kids getting checked out of school earlier or arriving to school, later? And is that consistent? And then another record to review is just our office discipline referrals, or ODRs. So are we seeing some patterns? Are we seeing a large number being referred to the office because of bullying or because of just poor conflict management? And if so, then perhaps we can strengthen our Tier 1 supports to provide them with those coping skills and things that they need. And then we could watch to see if our office discipline referrals decrease. Another informal measure, or a couple of informal methods rather, as opposed to measures, would be conversations in media. So talking with your colleagues, listening to students, talking to students, what's happening in their environments. Talking with your colleagues about, behaviors that they may be seeing in a child that you aren't seeing, and or vice versa. Talking with families, Mariana mentioned, including families, knowing their stories. And then also paying attention to the media, paying attention so you will know what kids are hearing, what kids are facing, and so that you can address, the needs they have, as well as help them interpret what's happening in their world. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's take a minute. And I want you to think about those two categories of assessments that we talked about, the formal and informal, and think about which would be most feasible and meaningful at your school. Okay, next slide. All right, now let's do a knowledge check. I've presented you with a lot of information. We've talked about the tiered system of supports. So in thinking about what's provided at these different tiers, skill building groups, things like social skills groups, they're typically examples of, are those Tier 1 supports, Tier 2 supports, or Tier 3 supports? And so the answer to that is tier 2. Typically, when you're doing those targeted skill building groups, they're in smaller, there's smaller numbers of children who are involved. It's not a whole class activity, but it's smaller numbers, and it could be delivered, either the teacher may deliver that, or it could be, you know, your school counselor or your school psychologist or school social worker. But it's in the small group, and you're focusing on a set of specific skills. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's recap. So in my section, remember I started out and I mentioned 2 essential steps that I wanted you to reflect on and to really think about in becoming trauma informed. So step number 1 was shifting our mindset from one of focusing on the problem and talking about the problem to focusing on what we could do to impact that problem. Okay, so we want to become solution focused. Number 2, so step number 2 was to investigate the systems of support that we have in place in our school. So our multi-tiered systems of support, you know, investigate the framework, perhaps use a self-assessment tool to figure out what are some things that we have that are very positive, and then what are some areas that we would need some more support in enhancing. And then lastly, we talked about some ways of assessing and aligning the needs that your students have with supports that you could provide them. So I appreciate very much the opportunity to share this information with you, and I'm going to turn it over to Yun-Soo.
Thank you, Conra. Now we'll go ahead and take a short break. Next slide. And we want to provide you all with the option to pause and engage with us in a deep breathing exercise. We know this was a lot of important but heavy information to take in, and we encourage you to either engage in this exercise with us or any other method for you to take a much needed break. So first, try to find a quiet, comfortable place to sit or lie down, and feel free to close your eyes. Take a normal breath in and out. Now let's try a deep breath. So put one hand on your stomach, just below your ribs, and then your other hand on your chest. Go ahead and breathe in slowly and deeply through your nose. And as you fill your lungs, your belly should push your hand out and your chest should not move. And now exhale slowly through your mouth or nose, if that feels more natural to you, keeping your jaw relaxed. And notice your hand on your stomach go back in and use it to push all the air out. And let's repeat. Inhale slowly, fill your lungs, feel your belly expand. Then exhale slowly, keep your jaw relaxed. Feel your belly come back in slowly. Let's repeat. Inhale slowly, fill your lungs with air. Feel your belly expanding. Then exhale slowly, keep your jaw relaxed. Feel your belly come back in slowly. Again, inhale slowly, fill your lungs, feel your belly expanding. Then exhale slowly, keep your jaw relaxed, feel your belly come back in. Again, inhale slowly, fill your lungs with air, feel your belly expanding. Then exhale slowly, keeping your jaw relaxed. Feel your belly come back in slowly. One more time, let's repeat. Inhale slowly, fill your lungs with air. Feel your belly expanding. Then exhale slowly, keep your jaw relaxed. And feel your belly come back in slowly. I want you to go ahead and notice and reflect on how you're feeling, and consider adding in a few minutes into your day to deep breathe alone, with your colleagues, or with your students. Next slide. So thank you again for joining us today. My name is Yeon-Soo Park, and I'm a senior education researcher at SRI International. I'm also a child clinical psychologist by training and have worked extensively with children experiencing trauma. And so this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. So let's continue with our presentation to talk about trauma-informed approaches to help students. Next slide. So schools can be very helpful settings to provide support. Schools play this unique role in the lives of students and families and can provide a range of social, emotional, and academic opportunities. And school staff who interact with students and families on a daily basis are likely also very aware and sensitive to students' needs, being aware of the surrounding community, things that they may experience, and their family lives as well. You can also screen and identify students for services at schools, as well as provide these services at schools like a skills building group. And as I mentioned earlier, schools do have contact with students almost every day, and providing resources and supports in the school setting can generally be more efficient and convenient than clinic-based services, although we do know our current hybrid or virtual world looks very different right now. And importantly, a positive school and classroom environment. So learning environments that are safe, engaging, and supportive, and healthy and supportive relationships with caring adults like teachers are really crucial protective factors that buffer against many of the negative impacts of trauma and stress, which Mariana discussed earlier in the presentation. So next slide. Before we go into what trauma-informed schools look like, think about what words come to mind for you when you think about a trauma-informed school. You can think about your school or other schools, but when someone says a trauma-informed or a trauma-sensitive school, think about what words pop into your head. And we'll go ahead and use this information as we talk about the strategies that are relevant. So next slide. Let's continue to talk about trauma-informed schools. Next slide. And we'll start with what the research tells us. So with the growing research and knowledge about trauma, trauma-informed approaches are being promoted and picked up across schools and districts at a very fast pace. And there has also been, understandably, increased local, state, and federal initiatives to support this work and approaches. Now, there was a comprehensive review study done in 2019, and the goal of that study was to see if trauma-informed schools, so not standalone trauma interventions or programs, but that trauma-informed schools impact student outcomes. And these outcomes included student trauma symptoms and their mental health outcomes, students' academic performance, behaviors, and their social emotional functioning. So what this study found was that after they did a comprehensive search of the research literature, that no studies met their inclusion criteria. And these criteria included questions like, did the study use a rigorous research design? Was the study conducted in a school setting? Did the study include the core elements of a trauma-informed school, which we'll talk more about in just a bit? Did the study look at student level outcomes related to the categories that I just mentioned? So they try to find rigorous studies that met these criteria, but found that there were none to be included in their review. So what the authors of that review study concluded is that right now we don't have evidence to support that trauma-informed approaches in schools are having positive effects on this range of student outcomes. So we don't know if these approaches in schools are actually leading to the kinds of changes that we want to see. And one difficulty is that trauma-informed approaches can look very different across schools. There are a lot of resources and guidance documents out there that we've shared in this presentation as well. And when schools say that they're trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive, it's hard to know exactly what the schools are doing and how much variation there is based on things like the student population, the community context, and so forth. And when schools are doing vastly different things, as you can imagine, it's hard to evaluate and know exactly what's working and what's not. And also, trauma-informed approaches involve these multiple tiers, as Conrad just presented, which makes it difficult for us to untangle the different components at the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 levels. And designing rigorous large-scale studies to look at these effects across these levels is really challenging, but we do want to note that this shouldn't stop us from trying. I think it makes it even more important to make sure that we have these rigorously designed and implemented studies to make sure that what we're doing is helping our kids. And where schools play a critical role, for example, in choosing evidence-based interventions that can be implemented well, or referring to resources that are grounded in research, and schools making sure that you're monitoring and evaluating student outcomes to make sure that what you're doing is working. So let's then talk about what we mean when we say trauma-informed schools, so that we can all have a shared understanding as we're thinking about what we can do that's grounded in research. Next slide. So a trauma-informed approach is this overarching framework to guide systems like schools and districts, and it involves strategies and practices across different levels. It's not a standalone program or a one-and-done training. It's really this organizational cultural shift that involves a shared sense of responsibility and ongoing support, ongoing reflection, and continuous improvement. And there's no one agreed upon definition of a trauma-informed approach, but it has been proposed that it boils down to 3 overarching core domains. And we'll cover this more in detail in the next slide. So the first domain is workplace and professional development. This means that all staff, so educators, or administrators, custodial staff, paraprofessionals, that all staff have a shared understanding of trauma and its impacts on learning and behaviors. And everybody understands that a school-wide approach is needed. And because of this shared understanding and knowledge, school staff can recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma better, and they learn skills to respond in effective and supportive ways. The second domain is organizational environment and practices. So this means that there are policies and procedures in place to support students experiencing trauma. This can include changes to disciplinary practices, for example, and protocols to develop partnerships and collaborations with community providers and with families to make sure to support students comprehensively. And again, there's this sense of shared responsibility and effort to empower each other. And instead of just asking, what can I do, or what can he do, or what can she do to fix this child, there's really a movement towards what can we do as a team to support all children. So for example, asking questions like, how can we learn about diverse backgrounds and experiences so that we can make sure to support all children and families? There may also be changes to the physical and social emotional environment of the school to promote this overall sense of safety. As Mariana talked about earlier, trauma fundamentally threatens children's sense of safety and security. And so in order to help students succeed, staff can help them to feel safe in all areas of the school. So in class, on the bus, on the way to school, during recess, etc. And the last domain is trauma-focused practices. Reflecting back on what Conrad discussed, there is a tiered system of support involving universal, so tier 1, targeted, tier 2, and tier 3 individualized supports that incorporate knowledge about trauma and are evidence-based. Next slide. Another way to put this is that trauma-informed schools, all aspects of the educational environment, from workforce training to engagement with students and families, to the school's procedures and policies, all of these are grounded in an understanding of trauma and its impacts, and that addressing trauma's impact school-wide and promoting resiliency for every single student is at the center of the educational mission. Next slide. So let's pause and do a quick knowledge check. So what do we know right now about trauma-informed schools? And you see 4 options here. 1, They're very effective at improving student outcomes. 2, trauma-informed approaches generally look similar across schools and districts. 3, we do not yet know if they're effective at improving student outcomes. And 4, they are not effective at improving student outcomes. So feel free to pause the recording, take a few seconds to think about what the answer to that is based on what we've discussed. And the correct answer is that we do not yet know if trauma-informed schools are effective at improving student outcomes based on that 2019 review study. Next slide. And now with all that information in mind, we want to ask you to consider how trauma-informed do you think your school is right now? So would you say that your school is very trauma-informed, somewhat, maybe minimally, or not trauma-informed at all? So based on what we've discussed about what trauma-informed schools are, the core domains, and the descriptions, think about where your school might be at as we continue to talk about strategies to support students and how you may be able to share that information with your colleagues. So next slide. Now that we've talked about trauma-informed schools, let's continue to talk about what educators can actually do to support all students in this context. Next slide. So far, we've shared information about trauma and its impacts, information about what a trauma-informed school means, and also the research evidence or lack of research evidence on trauma-informed schools and impacting student outcomes. So with all this information, what can school staff do to help students? So staff can use specific strategies that are grounded in existing scientific literature. So there's well-established research about the negative impacts of trauma, which you've heard about. There's well-established research on the risk and protective factors of trauma. And there's also research on the positive impacts of specific trauma intervention programs. And there are strategies that are grounded in this body of research. And we're going to focus on the four core strategies that are listed here on this slide. And we'll be going into more detail for each strategy in just a minute. And we really want teachers and school staff to feel empowered, to feel responsible to implement these strategies on a day-to-day basis. And we also want to highlight the importance of clearly documenting what you're doing in terms of strategies and practices, which will help you to monitor and evaluate what you're doing to see if what you're doing is working. And we'll cover this concept a bit more in our second module. So next slide. So let's go through these four strategies a bit more in detail. So the first is to promote a safe and supportive school environment and climate, which can help students feel safe and secure and increase the resiliency of all students. So this includes the physical space of the school, like being well lit, having safe spaces for after school or extracurricular activities, if appropriate, and quiet spaces for students to go to if they feel overwhelmed or dysregulated. Staff are also actively monitoring the hallways and other common areas to minimize and address potential risks to students like bullying. Staff are respectful and calm when they interact with students and families from diverse backgrounds and experiences. Staff communicate clear roles and expectations for student behavior, and they're consistently enforcing and reinforcing these roles and expectations. Staff maintain daily routines and activities as much as possible and try to avoid sudden, unpredictable changes. And disciplinary practices are not punitive and instead are focused on positive reinforcement. So you're really trying to catch students being good and not trying to catch students being bad. Next slide. The next strategy is to build strong relationships with students and families, since research tells us that social support and connectedness can help to buffer the negative impacts of trauma. So this means that staff are empowering student and family voices. So giving students clear choices and options, working together with students and families to make decisions, and giving them opportunities to voice their concerns and opinions, for example, through focus groups. Staff are also greeting students by name. They really know the students. They're engaging in conversations about students' hobbies and interests, and they spend time just listening to them and getting to know them and their families. And also, instead of asking students what's wrong with you when you're dealing with a difficult behavior, you tend to ask what happened to you, to think about how trauma might be playing a role in their behaviors. And staff also consider a strengths-based or resiliency approach to empower students, meaning that they're shifting from asking, what are they doing wrong, to what are they doing right? Next slide. Third, building social emotional skills to foster resiliency is important because students exposed to trauma experience a range of social emotional challenges that have negative impacts on their abilities to cope. And to build these skills, staff can teach students to identify and express emotions using methods like journaling or role playing. And staff can also teach regulation techniques like deep breathing, which we just did during the break, and also mindfulness. And you can also model pro-social behaviors in your daily interactions with students and other staff. You can also provide students with a range of choices and options. So for example, providing students with the option to either write an essay or do an oral presentation for an assignment, to really empower them in decision-making, and also to provide options for students in how they can navigate potentially, different social situations and dilemmas, and to guide them, asking them questions like, what would happen if you said this? And what about if you did this? Staff can also use evidence-based social emotional learning programs for students, for which the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, has a nice program guide to help you choose a program that will work best for your context. Next slide. And the last strategy is to minimize potential trauma triggers, which are reminders of past traumatic experiences that automatically cause the body to react as if the traumatic event is happening again in that moment. So this means that traumatized students may re-experience trauma when they're exposed to environments or situations that remind them of the trauma that they experienced or are continuing to experience outside of school. So examples of such triggers include harsh or shaming discipline, like being called out on their behaviors in front of their peers, or isolating that student completely. Another example is loud noises, chaotic, busy environments, physical touch, also uncertainties about expectations or sudden changes in routine. And in response to these triggers, staff may see students respond in a variety of ways. So you may see breakdowns that consist of yelling or screaming. You may see verbal or physical aggression. You may see defiance or withdrawing behaviors as well. And staff can be mindful of potential triggers to try to minimize them as best as possible, and also understand and recognize that these possible responses to triggers, rather than thinking that the child is just acting out, for example. Next slide. So let's do our last quick knowledge check. So based on everything that we've discussed, what is one way that school staff can help students experiencing trauma? Is it 1, physically embrace students in all interactions? 2, change schedules frequently? 3, provide choices for students to complete academic work? Or 4, clearly point out and focus on what the students are doing wrong? So take a moment, feel free to pause the recording to think about what the answer might be. And the correct answer is to provide choices for students to complete academic work, which will help empower them and guide them in learning how to make decisions. So before we move on to the next slide, feel free to take a pause. We know that these trigger responses don't just apply to students and can also apply to adults too. So feel free to take a moment, close your eyes and breathe, and pause the recording before we continue. Next slide. So in our second module, we're going to be going into even more detail on how you can support students using very concrete strategies, how to address some common barriers you may face in supporting students, and also what to do in moments of a breakdown or a crisis that may be related to trauma. And we'll be using a resource to frame this discussion that was developed through another REL Appalachia project. And this resource identifies possible trauma symptoms and also everyday strategies that teachers can use to address these symptoms, especially strategies that they can use in these high intensity moments. So for example, with breakdowns. And again, we're very excited to cover this in detail in our next second module. Next slide. So to recap, students or staff can support students experiencing trauma by promoting a safe and supportive school climate, by building strong relationships with students and families, by building students' social emotional skills, and lastly, minimizing potential trauma triggers. So thank you for your attention, and I'm going to pass it back to Ladata.
Thank you, Yunsu, and thanks to each of you for joining us today. I hope that you found the information to be helpful. I think that our facilitators provided great information that can be very helpful as we try to apply these things in our schools, in our classrooms, and help children in these challenging times. Next slide. So I hope that you will reflect on what was most helpful for you. We do hope that you want to learn more and that you will stay connected to us through the REL Appalachia webpage, the YouTube channel, so you can continue to take advantage of these outstanding resources. Next slide, please. When we do live events, we also survey all of our participants, and we hope that you will join us for live events in the future so that we will be able to get your feedback. Your thoughts are very important to us, and we look forward to hopefully hosting you on a live event in the near future. Next slide, please. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to REL Appalachia. Remember that there are CEUs available, and if you can let us know that you're interested in that, we will get you a certificate of completion. And next slide, please. We appreciate you being here. Here's the contact information if you need it. Also a link to the regional educational labs, to REL Appalachia, to Yunsu, and we just appreciate your time investing in listening to this information, and hope that you have a great day. Thank you again for joining us.